So we left off with a big nut in the Texas annexation and the remaining, this last third of the United States, so to speak, and how it was acquired. And really, it's not pretty. We're not going to really be getting into this in grade 5 social studies, but I'll still give you some of the background knowledge here. Texas was originally, all of this area was part of Mexico. And Mexico knows it today, for instance. We want to forget about how this land was acquired and just move on, but Mexico certainly remembers when it was theirs. And initially, there were Mexican farmers in Texas, and a lot of Americans were allowed to move into Texas, and Mexico was willing to tolerate them. They were called Anglos. And the Mexican farmers and the Anglos were willing to put up with each other for a time. And Texas and or this area is part of Mexico. They banned slavery, but the Anglos allowed slavery in, and they banned let's see, they were against each other religiously. Like the Mexicans were Catholic and the Anglos were Protestant, but they looked the other way religiously as well. And the Anglos started buying more and more land in Texas, and then there were political fights between the Mexicanos in Texas and the Mexican government in Mexico City. And of course, the Americans were in Texas, and they were eager for Texas independence. And Texas fought that war and won, and Texas then became a nation. And they immediately applied to join the United States, unsurprisingly, which this is looking really ugly at this point, if you ask me. But the United States wasn't willing to let Texas in. This was around 1835, because the United States did not want to let in another slave state, especially the northern states. They weren't willing to let that happen. And finally, in the year 1845, approximately 8 or 10 years later, Texas reapplied, and some new states were added in the upper Midwest to allow for Texas to come in and balance the power of slave states to free states in the country. And we can talk about this really at another time. Then the final major expansion was this idea of Mexican cession, which took place at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1845. And this was just a really brutal land grab by the United States, where they were initially fighting over the border between Texas and Mexico, which was supposed to be the Rio Grande River. And the United States ended up sending troops beyond the river, instigating the Mexicans to defend their land, and they had a skirmish. And then the United States said, "How dare you fire on our troops? This means war." And so the United States proceeded to storm into Mexico, take over Mexico City, really rape and pillage their way for the entire time, really ugly. And then they essentially held a gun to the Mexican government's head and said, "Hey, why don't you sell us all of California for something like $13 or $15 million again?" And Mexico really had no choice, and that was called Mexican cession as a result of the Mexican-American War. And boy, that's nutty to think. California's got the 6th biggest economy in the world right now if it were a separate country. So that's absolutely nuts. But in any case, we don't really get into the Mexican-American War, but it certainly wouldn't be pretty, and I think it would be pretty hard to teach 5th graders. The Oregon country was negotiated between the British, who had taken over French Canada all the way back in 1763, believe it or not, in a previous war. And the English were completing their own westward expansion up in Canada, and they were making claims about where the border of the United States and Canada should be. Certainly this line of latitude was not the only thing they were taking into consideration. And the United States and England negotiated this line for the Oregon country up in the upper northwest. A couple of other, we have the Gadsden Purchase, 1863, interestingly, and then I'm not even sure what this little bit up here is, but it's clearly with Britain. These were small potatoes. The last one, actually, which took place in the 1860s, was the purchase of Alaska from Russia, and they didn't really know. The Bering Strait seemed like a natural barrier for Russia, and I don't think they really knew what they had in the Alaskan territory, and that was insanely cheap. Finally, we go to the conquest of Hawaii. So westward expansion really didn't just stop with the continental United States. It was in 1898, or sometime in the late 1890s, the acquisition of Hawaii, which was really a complete and a military conquest. It wasn't even peaceful. So when we take a look at this, we have the Revolution. The Louisiana Purchase was, I guess, a purchase that was decent. Texas annexation was really corrupt. Mexican-American War was vile. That's the Mexican Cession for the purchase of California, 1848. Purchase of Alaska during the Civil War, pretty good. And then we get ugly again with the conquest of Hawaii. So that's the part 2 of the political expansion of the United States. Of course, the expansion didn't turn out the way the government, it didn't happen the way the government would have preferred.